We are here at the Africa Liberty Forum in Nairobi, Kenya, and we've just concluded a talk on Bitcoin as freedom money. And I'm joined by Judy Imasuen, who is with the Human Rights Foundation, and she is a passionate Bitcoiner. She believes in sound money, and the HRF is doing some pretty incredible work, not just in Africa, but around the world, in promoting Bitcoin as a tool of freedom, but also the financial independence, the sovereignty that you have over your money is actually a human right, and I think the Human Rights Foundation has done well to articulate that message. So you just gave a presentation followed by a panel discussion, very interesting, a lot of local and other regional Bitcoiners on the panel. Maybe just talk us through your presentation. You use this phrase that Bitcoin is magic internet money. What was meant by that, and how do you interpret that?
So, I mean, generally, when people think about Bitcoin, they mostly think about it from one perspective. And it really depends on the group that you're talking to. Some people just see it as, it's just one fancy internet contraption that, I shouldn't concern myself with. Some see it as, like Sabina mentioned, like a get-rich-quick scheme. Some people see it mostly as, okay, this is too volatile, the number keeps going up and down, Is this going to be something that is actually useful? And the fact that it is, it's technology, right? You're here talking about money that a lot of people think about from the physical perspective, and you're talking about it from a technology perspective. It changes things. And so, the reason why I even went with use the magic internet money as an example, one, it's something that people have heard, and it echoes something that people tend to think about because it's on the internet. Most times when you hear objections about Bitcoin, it's like, it's on the internet, I can't feel it. I can't hold it. At least if I have, regular money, I can feel the bills, But here you are, you're talking about something that's purely on the internet. How is it going to, how is this going to be useful to me? And so I just wanted to tackle it from something that people are familiar with and show a different side to it, like something different from the common narrative. And most times when people think about Bitcoin, they just think about it from the angle of, okay, this is something that can get me rich. Whereas that's not the whole story about Bitcoin. There's something far greater to it. And I felt that by taking it from that angle and telling people that, yes, there is a magical aspect to Bitcoin, but it's the fact that it's something that can be used as a tool for freedom, I think it helps, people put it in the correct perspective, something that is more, relevant to them.
Yeah, and then obviously in the African context, I think there's some potential transformative utility to Bitcoin. And as you pointed out in your presentation, there's sort of a divide between the northern industrialized world and the south. And people talk about this in a political sense, but actually in a monetary sense, there's also this big gulf in that people in the industrialized world, they take their money for granted, they can move money between borders, whereas in the so-called South, there's actually a lot of friction and higher transaction costs associated with moving money around and trading across borders. Maybe unpack that a little bit for our audience.
So, like I mentioned in my presentation, there is a difference between the global north and the global south, particularly in terms of the advantages and the challenges that, respective regions face. And so when you're looking at the global north, they have an advantage, in terms of they can, move around with their money, which is already a global reserve currency, and have relative ease with it. But the story is not the same for people in the global south. They end up having more problems. Like you said, there's more friction. And so most times people don't see it from that perspective because they're not aware. Like one thing in Africa that we have a challenge with is telling our own stories. Most times our stories are told by other people from other lenses. And so when you're dealing with people that do not simply understand the challenges that we're facing, it seems as if, why don't you just use something that, we already have? But by the time you start explaining to them that, look, we don't, on a good day, have access to this thing that you say is very simple. It doesn't work that way. You start realizing that there is a problem somewhere. There is some sort of, I would say, disconnect from the general story. Because like I said, we don't tell our stories as often as we should. And so because we don't tell our stories as often as we should and the way we should, people don't know how difficult it actually is for those of us living in the global south. It's challenging. And so when you're looking at the, how do I put it, at the problem, it's far greater than, we think it is. Like, in order for the continent to develop, for example, we have to get to a point where we're able to, trade with each other. But we have all of these different problems and like different challenges that come along with it. And so, for example, if you're talking to someone who's, probably from the global north, whose currency is the global reserve currency, and you tell them that, look, I don't have access to this service, I don't have access to that service, I don't have access to that service. And it's something that they take for granted on a regular basis, and you finally inform them that, look, life is very different here. It changes the whole narrative, and it makes people more aware of the problems, and it starts, getting people to start asking questions. How do we overcome these challenges? How do we overcome these problems? And one thing that I love the most, especially, among our builder community, is that people are thinking about solutions to all of these problems, and they're innovating along that line. And it's, beautiful to see. There is hope, and when you focus on that, hope, like I mentioned, it is a sad thing when you're looking at it from the perspective of lack of access, right? But when you focus on the fact that there are people who recognize these problems and they're trying to, innovate and to solve all of these problems, it is another, like a ray of hope as well. And it's a nice thing to also share with people.
And I mean, you're from Nigeria originally. You're still based in Nigeria?
Yes.
If you think of just that as one case study, all of the problems that we've been discussing, so high levels of inflation, price volatility as well in terms of the currency and foreign currency risk, the inability to get money out because of capital controls and government intervention, other price controls, like, for example, in the fuel sector. That is the kind of perfect breeding ground for the use case of Bitcoin. And I think maybe people in established industrialized countries, you often see people from financial institutions or regulators or policymakers saying, well, what's the use case? But we have an abundance of use cases here in Africa. And I think Nigeria is probably one of the top 10 countries globally in terms of adoption, even though there's been very high regulatory hostility to Bitcoin. So it's kind of an emergent phenomenon that's starting to challenge the prevailing system.
Yes, and one way that I like to describe Nigeria is that when there's a challenge, there are people that are always looking for solutions, and that is simply credited to the resilience of the Nigerian people. And really, when you're looking at people who have a problem that they're trying to overcome, rather than just being, sad and focusing on the problem, you have people that are also thinking about how to rise above it, and that simply stems from people just wanting to go about their business regularly and live a normal life. Some people just assume that, it's, they want to do something fantastic, or like it all stems from wanting to do something huge. But when you look at it, some of these things are just very basic things that I would say people in the global north just take for granted. Just being able to do a particular, make a particular transaction is very simple. It's just, from point A to B. But then when you're looking at it from the other side, it's like, okay, it's not just from point A to B, it's like from point A to E. There's so many steps to take, and sometimes people are not even able to get to the final point, but the problem persists. And so it's like when you're looking at people that say, there's no use case, I always tell them that no, there is a far greater story that you're not looking at. That's why one thing that I hope more Africans do is to tell their stories, so that more people know that there is actually a use case, that there is actually some sort of utility around all of this, and it changes the conversation and helps people see it in a different light.
Yeah, exactly. And look, I think everybody who knows Nigerians will testify that they're a very enterprising people, and there's a kind of hustle culture, the same here in Kenya where we're speaking today. But you want people who are putting in a lot of energy and work into generating value to be able to store their value for the long term. You want capital preservation, which I think Bitcoin offers. You also in your presentation spoke about how Bitcoin is borderless, it's permissionless, and also it is censorship resistant. Speak us through some of those themes.
So I think one, characteristic of Bitcoin that I would say is particularly useful, especially in this context, is, you have the borderless nature of it. You don't have to start worrying about how you're going to get it across. You're able to get it across. Like, you don't have to start jumping through, 10 million hurdles in order to get it across to another person.
And all these intermediaries.
Exactly. So like it's just about sending a Bitcoin transaction from from your wallet to a person who has a wallet, a Bitcoin wallet. And take your pick from the number of Bitcoin wallets, and you just initiate the transaction and the person already gets the Bitcoin. Imagine having to do this from one country that does not have a way of interfacing with another country. For example, if you're using the more conventional systems, it might probably take a day or two, take some time. The wait is frustrating, especially when you don't really trust the system. You'll be wondering, where's my money, right? But when you have something like Bitcoin, it's just, like I said, it's just a matter of opening your Bitcoin wallet, initiating the transaction, and the person gets it in their own, Bitcoin wallet. It has crossed the border. And that, just thinking about it is life-changing for a lot of people who just want to send that value across, just to go about their regular day and go about their regular business, right? Something very simple, those very, mundane things of life, especially when you're looking at it from the perspective of someone who struggles to do all of these things. That in itself is life-changing. And then you look at the censorship-resistant aspect. Unfortunately, you have places that exploit, current systems to harm other people, But then later on, when you have censorship-resistant money, people who are speaking out about things like, police brutality, or speaking out about justice, good things.
High taxation.
Exactly. Good things that we want in our societies. You have some people that, have that courage to speak out, but they're being unjustly penalized for this. Just imagine how that coerces them to stay silent, But you need advocates,
There was a delegate here who testified that he was running a human rights initiative, some training in his country, and he was interfacing with some officials, and then the next thing, his bank account for his organization was frozen, and he couldn't pay his staff and couldn't engage in his work. So I think there's a direct link between money and civil liberties, and for authoritarian governments, they're going to be looking for levers to suppress opposition, and financial control is a way for them to exercise that authoritarian power.
Yes, and so that's really where the whole censorship resistant quality of Bitcoin shines through, because for example, when you're looking at the example that that participant gave, you see that there were a lot of people that were reliant on that work, and when his financing was cut, or rather his access to his finance was cut, it affects a lot more people than than just him, and so when you're looking at the whole censorship-resistant quality of Bitcoin, right, and you think about, especially in line with stories like this, you see that it is actually very powerful. It can help. It does change the situation quite a bit for people that are working towards seeing good changes, where they live, and this is something that is important.
Well, Judy Imasuen, thank you very much for joining us and for your work. We hope to stay in touch, and if you are a Bitcoiner and you support the work of the Free Market Foundation, and you'd like to help us in our advocacy for sound money and private property rights, you can please donate Bitcoin to us. There's a link in the description below where you can send us your sats. But Judy, thank you very much again, and hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference.
Thank you for having me, David.